Welcome to Inside the Criminal World. In this video, we delve into a chilling tale of despair and mystery set within the decaying walls of Winnebago Mental Health Institute, a place where the darkest secrets of the past seep into the present. Follow the haunting journey of Clara Henshaw and the tormented souls who never truly escaped, as we explore the eerie echoes of sorrow and the relentless forces that bind the living to a legacy of unspeakable tragedy. Prepare yourself for a story where reality blurs with nightmare, and every shadow holds a secret waiting to be revealed. I still remember the first time I stepped through the heavy, rusted gates of Winnebago Mental Health Institute. The overwhelming odor, a sickening blend of antiseptic, damp mildew, and a faint tang of metal, assailed my senses immediately, as if warning me in silence of the darkness that lay within. It was autumn 1974 when I arrived at Winnebago as a clinical psychology intern, full of youthful eagerness and naivete, convinced that my studies would reveal the intricacies of troubled minds. Little did I know that Winnebago was not merely an institution for the broken but a crucible of ancient sorrow and unspeakable secrets. Originally established in the late 19th century as the Northern Asylum for the Insane, the building had long since evolved into a repository for those whom society had cast aside. The corridors, lined with peeling paint and faded institutional posters, echoed with the silent suffering of souls who had lost all hope. It was here, in a forgotten wing known as Ward D, a section reserved for the most dangerous and unstable patients, that I was assigned. Among the many lost spirits was Clara Henshaw, a 26-year-old whose case file was as enigmatic as it was horrifying. Charged with the murder of 3 individuals, each victim discovered with a slashed throat, eyes removed, and their bodies arranged in ritualistic poses, Clara had been arrested at the scene of her most recent crime, standing impassively amid the flickering candlelight of a small-town church. Her refusal to speak during interrogation led authorities to deem her criminally insane, and she was committed to room 42 at Winnebago without a trial. I first encountered Clara on a damp Tuesday morning. I was led through the endless, dimly lit corridors by a middle-aged nurse whose tired eyes and cigarette-stained fingers betrayed years of resigned routine. As we walked, she murmured in a flat tone, "She's quiet, but I believe she talks to something unseen." Those words lingered in my mind long after we reached our destination. The door to room 42 was a massive metal barrier, secured with a double bolt lock and equipped with a small observation window that offered a meager glimpse inside. With a slow, deliberate motion, the nurse selected a key from her ring and unlocked the door with a resonant click that seemed to reverberate down the corridor. Inside, the room was sparse and oppressive. A single, battered cot with a rusted iron frame dominated the space, its thin mattress barely offering any comfort. A small, grimy window near the ceiling allowed only a trickle of light to penetrate the darkness, casting long, shifting shadows on the cracked concrete floor. And there, sitting on the edge of the cot, was Clara Henshaw. Her presence was almost otherworldly, her dark hair cascaded over delicate shoulders, framing a face that appeared soft and fragile, entirely at odds with the monstrous acts attributed to her. Yet it was her eyes that struck me the most, deep, hollow, and unyielding. They seemed to harbor an ancient sorrow and a knowing that defied simple explanation. I introduced myself as Daniel, my voice trembling just enough to betray my inner anxiety. Clara did not respond verbally. Instead, she offered the slightest twitch of her finger, a minute gesture that somehow confirmed her awareness of my presence. The silence in that room was palpable, heavy with unspoken truths. After the nurse left with a perfunctory good luck, I remained alone with Clara, recording every subtle movement in my notebook. Every scribble of ink on paper made me feel as though I were being drawn deeper into a narrative that transcended clinical observation. In the following days, my encounters with Clara grew increasingly surreal. I began to notice that her silence was not merely a byproduct of her mental state but a calculated part of her behavior. Each session in room 42 was punctuated by moments where her eyes, those endless wells of darkness, seemed to follow my every move, as if she were not merely a passive subject but an active participant in a conversation beyond words. I would ask her simple questions about her past, about her feelings, and she would only respond with a barely perceptible change in expression, a small twitch of her hand, or a soft sigh that carried a weight I could not decipher. Once, as I attempted to probe into her memories, she leaned forward ever so slightly and whispered in a voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the silence, "You are not the first to listen." I could not tell if her words were a warning, a confession, or something else entirely. That day left me with a lingering unease. I began to wonder whether the true horror of Winnebago lay not in the clinical details of its patients' disorders, but in the intangible atmosphere of decay and despair that permeated its every corner. It was as though the building itself exhaled a slow, steady breath of sorrow, infecting everyone who crossed its threshold. Each night, as I returned to my modest dormitory within the institute, I felt the oppressive weight of that atmosphere follow me. The corridors outside my room, usually alive with distant conversations and the occasional clatter of equipment, had taken on an eerie stillness. I often lay awake, the ink from my notebook drying on the page, while the faint sound of scratching echoed in my ears, a sound that I later realized might have been the building itself trying to speak its ancient language of anguish. One particularly restless night, I awoke to an inexplicable sound of persistent, almost deliberate scratching coming from somewhere near my closet. I sat in the dim light of my desk lamp, heart pounding, and listened as the sound slowly receded into a haunting silence. Unable to shake the feeling that something was amiss, I glanced at my notebook and found a line I did not remember writing: "She is waiting." The handwriting was unmistakably mine, yet I could not recall the moment of its creation. A chill ran down my spine, and I realized that the strange occurrences I had been dismissing as the product of exhaustion were, in fact, something far more sinister. That line, that simple phrase, began to haunt me as persistently as the memory of Clara's unmoving gaze. I found myself revisiting room 42 in my thoughts over and over again, replaying each session, each subtle gesture, as if trying to decipher a code that might unlock the dark mystery surrounding her. In quiet moments, I wondered whether the presence I sensed in her eyes was connected to the inexplicable events within my own quarters, whether the malevolent force that seemed to dwell in the forgotten corners of Winnebago had begun to seep into my very soul. And so, with each passing day, the boundary between clinical detachment and personal terror blurred further until I could no longer claim to be simply an observer. I was becoming entangled in the web of despair that Winnebago wove around its inhabitants, and Clara Henshaw was at the center of it all, a silent, inscrutable beacon of a truth too horrible to fully comprehend. I left room 42 that day with a growing sense of foreboding, as if the dark corridors of the institute were slowly closing in on me. The image of Clara's unyielding gaze, the cryptic whisper of "You are not the first to listen," burned itself into my memory, a spectral reminder that I was not just witnessing a clinical case but an unfolding horror that defied explanation. I knew then that Winnebago was more than just an asylum, it was a threshold between our fragile world of light and an ancient, brooding darkness that had long awaited its chance to re-emerge. I could feel it in every creak of the floor, every sigh of the wind that whispered through the cracked windows of the building, and in the silent spaces between the measured words of my notes. That was the beginning of my journey, a journey into a realm where reality and nightmare intertwined, where every shadow carried a secret, and every moment was saturated with the weight of sorrow and terror. Even as I attempted to continue my work, I knew that I would never be the same. Winnebago had etched its mark into my soul, and Clara Henshaw, with her delicate features and those fathomless eyes, would remain an indelible part of my existence, haunting my dreams and my waking moments alike. After leaving room 42 that fateful day, I found myself haunted by an insidious presence that grew ever stronger with each passing hour. The images of Clara's unyielding gaze and the cryptic whispers that echoed in the silence of Winnebago had begun to infiltrate every facet of my daily life. In the sterile light of the Institute's corridors, where peeling paint and distant echoes mingled with the cold hum of fluorescent bulbs, I could no longer distinguish between clinical observation and a nightmare come to life. Every step I took seemed to be measured by the heavy, relentless rhythm of despair that pulsed through the walls. I would often catch myself staring absently at the scuffed floor tiles, feeling that beneath each crack lay an untold story of sorrow and decay, a secret message from the darkness that had claimed Winnebago and now, somehow, was seeping into my own soul. In the weeks following my first encounter with Clara, I began to document not only her silent gestures and subtle twitches but also the inexplicable occurrences that plagued my nights. I kept a battered notebook in which I recorded every detail: the soft scratching I heard in the dead of night, the faint sound of whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls of my small dormitory room, and the occasional glimpse of a shadow moving just beyond the edge of my vision. At first, I tried to convince myself that these experiences were nothing more than the product of overwork and isolation, manifestations of a mind stretched too thin by the oppressive atmosphere of Winnebago. But with each passing day, it became increasingly clear that the phenomena were no mere hallucinations. There was a malevolent intelligence at work, one that seemed to take delight in disturbing my fragile sense of reality. My sessions with Clara grew more charged as well. In room 42, time seemed to slow to a crawl. The dim light filtering through the grimy window played tricks on my eyes, and the silence in that room was thick enough to be cut with a knife. Clara's face, so delicate and yet marked by an unspoken sadness, appeared to shift subtly with every passing moment. I recalled one afternoon when, after several minutes of fruitless questioning about her past, she leaned forward just enough that I could see the faintest glimmer of tears welling in her dark eyes. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "They never let me go." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I realized that her silence was not mere reticence but a deliberate withholding of a truth too painful to speak aloud. I pressed her for more, but she offered no further explanation, only a lingering look that conveyed both resignation and an unspoken plea for understanding. In those moments, I felt as if I were glimpsing a hidden part of my own soul, a part that had long been locked away and now was being forcefully opened by the sheer force of her despair. Every evening, when the oppressive hush of Winnebago gave way to the restless hours of the night, I found myself alone with my thoughts. The walls of my room, once a safe barrier against the unknown, now seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I would lie awake, listening to the steady tick of a clock that marked time with an almost mocking regularity, while the sound of scratching, soft at first, then gradually more insistent, echoed from somewhere beyond my sight. I began to suspect that the scratching was not confined to one location. It was as if the very building itself was trying to communicate its secrets. I recalled the moment when I had seen a faint smear of dark residue along the edge of my closet door, a mark that could not be wiped away by ordinary means. That mark became a symbol, a silent testament to the idea that something had been left behind in Winnebago, something that now clung to me as persistently as a shadow in the corner of my eye. I tried to maintain a semblance of routine, attending my daily sessions, taking careful notes, and even engaging in small talk with colleagues. But even in those fleeting moments of normalcy, I sensed that I was being watched. The eyes of Winnebago seemed to follow me wherever I went, embedded in the very fabric of the Institute, in the peeling wallpaper, in the worn-out linoleum floors. In quiet moments at the nurse's station, I would catch a glimpse of a reflection, a fleeting, distorted image of a face that was not my own before it vanished as quickly as it appeared. I began to wonder if the darkness that had taken root here was not limited to the building but was part of something far more ancient, something that had been waiting for the right moment to reach out and claim its next victim. One particularly overcast afternoon, as I walked the long, echoing corridors of Ward D, I passed by a room that had been vacant for some time. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint, musty odor spilled out into the hallway. I hesitated, my heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and dread. I pushed the door open, half expecting to find nothing more than empty furniture covered in dust. Instead, I found an abandoned room with old medical equipment, stacks of yellowed papers, and a large, ornate mirror that dominated one wall. The mirror's surface was murky with age, but as I stared into it, I thought I saw a shape behind me, a vague, indistinct outline that vanished when I turned around. I dismissed it as my imagination, a trick of the dim light. Yet that incident left me unsettled, reinforcing the feeling that I was being slowly drawn into a vortex of hidden truths and lingering ghosts. Back in room 42, Clara remained an enigma. Each time I entered, I sensed that she was waiting for something, her eyes fixed on a horizon that I could never see. One day, as I sat across from her, I noted that the light from the window seemed to dance on her face in a way that made her features seem almost ethereal. For several long minutes, we sat in silence. The only sounds were the faint hum of the building's aging ventilation system and the distant murmur of voices that I couldn't quite place. Finally, she spoke in that familiar, whisper-soft tone, "You know what they say about those who listen too closely." I leaned forward, my curiosity mingling with a deep-seated fear, and asked, "What do they say?" Her eyes, dark and impenetrable, held mine as she replied simply, "They become part of the story." I was left with a shiver that ran through my entire body, as if her words had unlocked a door within me that I had long kept shut. Was it possible that my own fate was now intertwined with the mysteries of Winnebago, that by listening to the voices of its haunted corridors, I had already allowed a piece of its darkness to settle within me? The days turned into a blur of restless nights and increasingly erratic visions. In the solitude of my room, I began to scribble notes at a frantic pace, trying to piece together the disparate fragments of my experiences. I wrote of the soft scratching in the dead of night, of the uncanny feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, and of the occasional, inexplicable flash of movement in the peripheral vision. I recalled the times when Clara's gaze seemed to pierce through the veil of reality, her eyes reflecting a sorrow and wisdom that transcended the confines of her broken mind. I wrote of a moment when, as I sat by the window watching the rain blur the world outside, I thought I saw a faint silhouette standing in the reflection, a figure that vanished as soon as I blinked. Every entry in my notebook was a desperate attempt to capture the intangible, to give form to a terror that was as abstract as it was palpable. At times, I would find myself questioning whether the strange occurrences were the product of my own deteriorating state of mind, a casualty of the relentless pressure of witnessing human suffering and the inexplicable mysteries of Winnebago. Yet, the more I wrote, the more I felt that there was an external force at work. A force that had lain dormant for centuries, hidden in the crumbling walls and forgotten corridors of the Institute, waiting for the right moment to reach out and reclaim what was once lost. And now, with each passing day, it seemed to grow bolder, its presence more undeniable. The voices of the past, the whispered laments of those long dead, and the silent cries of souls still trapped within the walls began to form a chorus that only I could hear. They spoke in fragments, in half-remembered phrases and cryptic warnings that made little sense to my rational mind, yet filled me with a profound, bone-deep dread. "Listen, remember, belong," they echoed in the silence of the night, mingling with the persistent scratching and the soft rustle of unseen movements. I came to understand that Winnebago was not simply a building or an asylum, it was a living repository of human anguish, a vessel through which the darkness of despair could seep into the hearts of those who dared to listen. And I had become one of its unwilling recipients. One evening, as the sky darkened into an ominous gray and a cold wind swept through the broken windows of the Institute, I found myself once again standing before the door of room 42. I hesitated for a long moment, my hand hovering over the cold metal handle, as though uncertain whether to push forward or retreat into the relative safety of ignorance. But the pull was irresistible, and I stepped inside. The room was shrouded in shadows, the only light coming from a weak bulb overhead that cast trembling patterns on the wall. Clara was there, seated exactly as I had seen her so many times before, yet today there was an intensity in her gaze that made my heart race with a mix of fear and anticipation. She did not speak, but her eyes communicated everything, a silent understanding that the time had come for a revelation, for the truth that had been hidden behind layers of silence and sorrow to finally emerge. I sat down slowly, my notebook trembling in my grasp as I prepared to record whatever would unfold. For several long minutes, we sat in wordless communion. The air was heavy with expectancy, every second stretching out like an eternity. And then, in a voice barely audible above the sound of my own heartbeat, Clara whispered, "You are part of this now." The words were so soft, so laden with a profound finality, that I felt as if the very ground beneath me had shifted. In that moment, I realized that the darkness that had haunted Winnebago was not confined to its crumbling walls. It had reached out and entwined itself with my very being. I could feel it in the chill that ran down my spine, in the way my hands trembled uncontrollably. And as I stared into Clara's eyes, I understood that by listening too closely to the whispered secrets of that place, I had allowed its legacy to become mine as well. Leaving room 42 that night, I stepped out into the cold corridor with a newfound, overwhelming awareness that nothing would ever be the same again. Every creak of the floor, every faint rustle of air, seemed to speak of hidden histories and lingering regrets. I realized that Winnebago had opened a door within me, one that I could never close. The darkness was there, nestled deep within the recesses of my soul, a constant companion in every moment of solitude. Over the following days, I began to notice subtle changes in my perception. The once familiar patterns of light and shadow in the corridors took on a menacing quality. I caught glimpses of figures moving just beyond the corner of my eye, only to vanish when I turned to look. The distant sound of scratching, which had once been confined to my private quarters, now echoed throughout the building as if trying to communicate with me, to remind me of the inescapable truth I had come to accept. I was no longer an outsider observing a tragedy, I had become part of it. My colleagues spoke in hushed tones about the inexplicable occurrences at Winnebago, dismissing them as the byproducts of a stressful environment. Yet I knew better. I could feel the ancient sorrow of the institution, a malignant force that had been nurtured over generations, slowly seeping into my mind and soul. Each night, as I lay in bed listening to the whispers of forgotten voices, I felt a weight pressing down on me, a burden that seemed to say that I would forever carry the legacy of Winnebago within me. I started to question whether I had made the right choice in accepting this internship, whether my desire to understand the depths of human despair had opened a door I could never close. In the quiet moments, I recalled Clara's gentle yet haunted eyes, and the words she had spoken with such eerie calm, "You are part of this now." I began to wonder if that was not merely an observation, but a declaration, a pronouncement that my fate was sealed the moment I listened to the echoes of Winnebago. And so, with every passing day, as I struggled to maintain a semblance of normalcy in a world that now felt tinted with a perpetual gloom, I felt that ancient darkness growing inside me, weaving itself into the fabric of my thoughts and memories. I became increasingly isolated, unable to share the full horror of what I had experienced for fear that no one would understand or, worse, that they would try to cast me aside as another victim of my own imagination. The line between the institution's haunted corridors and my own existence blurred until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. I kept writing, pouring my fears and observations into my notebook in the hope that the act of recording might somehow exorcise the relentless dread that had taken hold. But each word only deepened the mystery, each sentence a reminder that the darkness was not something to be vanquished but an enduring part of my reality. I began to wonder if I had become a vessel for the sorrow of Winnebago, destined to wander through life with the heavy burden of its secrets. And though I longed for liberation, a small, persistent part of me also felt an inexplicable draw to the abyss, a morbid curiosity about the true nature of the force that had entwined itself with my soul. In the end, I realized that I was trapped between two worlds, the familiar, if painful, reality of everyday life, and the mysterious, foreboding realm that lay just beyond the veil of ordinary perception. As I walked through the dimly lit corridors of Winnebago for the last time that week, I felt as though I were leaving behind not just a building, but a part of myself that I would never recover. The memory of Clara Henshaw, with her silent warnings and sorrowful eyes, would remain etched in my mind forever, a constant reminder that some truths, once unearthed, bind us in ways that time cannot heal. And so, as I stepped out into the cold embrace of the night, the sound of distant scratching echoing behind me like a final farewell, I understood with a dreadful. I continued my days at Winnebago with a growing sense of disquiet that I could no longer ignore. Every corridor, every creaking floorboard, every flicker of the failing fluorescent light seemed imbued with a secret life of its own, a secret language that whispered of old sorrows and hidden terrors. My visits to room 42, where Clara Henshaw was confined, had become the focal point of my existence, not only as a clinical observer but as a reluctant witness to a darkness that defied logical explanation. In those moments, I began to feel that the boundary between the tangible world and something else, something ancient and malevolent, was dissolving. Each session with Clara deepened my unease. Her silence was punctuated by fleeting, almost imperceptible movements, a twitch of her left hand, the slight narrowing of her eyes that suggested she was not merely a passive victim of her shattered psyche, but rather an active conduit for forces that had long lain dormant within the decaying walls of Winnebago. One afternoon, as I sat on the cold, metallic cot in room 42 recording my observations, I became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere. The light filtering through the grimy window shifted, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor, and for a moment, I could almost believe that the darkness itself was breathing. Clara, who had been staring into the distance with her expression unchanged, slowly turned her head toward me. Her eyes, those bottomless, haunted eyes, seemed to glisten with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. Without a word, she extended her hand and traced a gentle pattern in the air as if outlining a map that only she could decipher. I leaned forward, compelled by a mix of clinical curiosity and a growing, inexplicable dread, and dared to ask, "Clara, what is it that you see?" Her lips parted slightly, and in a voice so soft it was nearly lost amid the ambient hum of the aging ventilation system, she replied, "It's not what I see, but what is waiting." The words struck me like a cold wind, sending shivers down my spine. I scribbled furiously in my notebook, trying to capture every nuance, every tremor in her tone, though I knew that no mere transcription could ever convey the profound terror that now gnawed at my core. Over the next few days, I found that my own perceptions began to warp in tandem with the increasing influence of Winnebago's oppressive energy. In the silent hours before dawn, I would lie awake on my narrow cot in the dormitory, staring at the ceiling as if searching for hidden messages in the cracks and faded patterns of peeling wallpaper. There was a persistent sound, a soft, rhythmic scratching emanating from somewhere behind the walls, a sound that seemed both distant and intimately near, as if the building itself were trying to communicate its dark history. I attempted to dismiss these sensations as mere products of fatigue and stress, yet deep down I sensed that they were real, that they were part of a broader tapestry of sorrow and malevolence woven into the very fabric of Winnebago. My dreams became a battleground of memories and nightmares. In one particularly vivid dream, I found myself wandering endless, labyrinthine corridors, each turn revealing more grotesque and unsettling images, faded photographs of long-deceased patients whose eyes seemed to follow me, rooms filled with scattered remnants of a life I could not comprehend, and in every shadow, I sensed the presence of something ancient, something that had long been imprisoned within these walls and was now yearning for release. I would hear disjointed voices, fragments of whispers that repeated the phrase, "You are not free," over and over, echoing in an endless refrain that both terrified and mesmerized me. In these dreams, Clara appeared frequently, a spectral figure with sorrow etched into her features, her eyes burning with an inner light that was both melancholic and foreboding. I would reach out to her, desperate for an explanation, but she would fade away like smoke before I could grasp her, leaving behind only the bitter taste of regret and the echo of her silent warnings. When I awoke, drenched in cold sweat and with my heart pounding, I would find my notebook open on my desk, the pages filled with my frantic scribbles and occasionally, a single line in my own handwriting that I swore I had not written, "The darkness waits for you." These occurrences became more frequent, each one blurring the lines between my waking hours and the nightmare that had seeped into my subconscious. I began to wonder if my continuous exposure to the sorrow and despair of Winnebago had not only altered my perceptions but had also allowed something else to take root within me. It was as though the very essence of the institution, the ancient grief, the collective pain of countless souls, had found a home in my own heart, slowly infecting every thought and emotion with its malignant presence. During one of my sessions with Clara, as I attempted to maintain my clinical detachment, I noticed a change in her demeanor. Her eyes, usually distant and impenetrable, seemed to flicker with an inner light as if reflecting the torment of centuries past. She spoke then, her voice a barely audible murmur that sent tremors of dread through me. "They call it the echo," she whispered, "the remnant of all that has been lost here. It lingers, feeding on our sorrow, waiting for a soul to be claimed." I stared at her, unable to find words to respond. The term echo reverberated in my mind like a haunting refrain, conjuring images of a vast, unseen presence that transcended the physical confines of Winnebago. Could it be that the whispers, the scratching, and the inexplicable marks were not random manifestations of a troubled mind but rather the deliberate work of an ancient force, a force that sought to entrap those who dared to listen too closely to its sorrowful lament? That day, as I left room 42, the weight of that question pressed heavily on me. I walked through the corridors with a growing sense of inevitability, as if each step carried me deeper into a fate from which there was no escape. Outside, the world beyond Winnebago seemed to pulse with a frenetic energy that was both alluring and terrifying. The bright, chaotic hum of life was a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the institution, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered if I could ever reclaim the innocence I had lost within those walls. But as I looked into my reflection in a cracked mirror in the infirmary, I saw not the face of a hopeful intern, but a man haunted by the echoes of unspeakable sorrow, a man whose eyes betrayed the creeping darkness that had taken residence within him. In the following weeks, the boundaries between my experiences at Winnebago and the rest of my life began to blur irreparably. I found that even in the midst of the bustling city, in the everyday clamor of normalcy, there were moments when the past would surge forth unbidden. At night, As I walked home along rain-slick streets illuminated by flickering neon signs, I would catch a glimpse of a figure in the periphery of my vision, a woman in a tattered dress with eyes as deep and sorrowful as Clara's, standing in the shadows before vanishing as quickly as she appeared. I tried to convince myself that it was merely a trick of the light or an overactive imagination born of too many sleepless nights, but the recurring vision became a persistent reminder that the legacy of Winnebago was not confined to a single building. It had seeped into me, infecting my dreams, my thoughts, and every quiet moment in between. I turned to my notebook with a desperate need to understand, to document every fragment of this encroaching darkness. I filled page after page with descriptions of the sounds, the images, and the sensations that had become my constant companions. I wrote of the cold, inexorable touch of dread that seemed to grip my soul in the silent hours before dawn, of the way the walls of my dormitory appeared to whisper secrets that no one else could hear, of the fleeting moments when I felt an almost physical presence watching me from the darkness. And with each word, I felt the boundary between observer and participant dissolve further until I could no longer tell if I was writing about a phenomenon external to me or if I had, in some unknowable way, become its vessel. I began to suspect that the very act of listening, of recording every eerie detail, had allowed the darkness to embed itself within me more deeply. Clara's earlier words, "You are part of this now," echoed in my mind with a terrible finality. I questioned whether I would ever be free of the haunting presence that had followed me out of Winnebago. Was it possible that by venturing into the abyss of its sorrow, I had inadvertently invited the echo to make a home in my heart? In the quiet solitude of those nights, as I wrestled with these questions, a slow, creeping realization took root. I was no longer merely an intern, an observer of human frailty. I had become part of a larger, more sinister narrative, one that spanned beyond the sterile walls of an asylum and into the deepest recesses of the human soul. The echo was not simply an echo of past sorrows, it was a living, breathing presence that fed on the pain and isolation of those who dared to confront it. And in confronting it, I had set my own fate in motion. With this grim understanding, I resolved to continue my work, not out of some misguided sense of duty, but because I felt an inexorable pull to unravel the mystery that now defined my every moment. I could not, in good conscience, ignore the signs or pretend that the darkness was nothing more than a figment of my imagination. Every encounter with Clara, every whispered message in the silent corridors of Winnebago, had led me to this point, a point of no return. And so, with a mixture of dread and determination, I accepted that my life would never be the same. I had become a part of the story, entangled in a web of despair from which there was no escape. The darkness was now a part of me, as constant and unyielding as the very night itself, and I would have to learn to live with its heavy, unrelenting presence. I left room 42 that day with a heavy, unshakable sense of foreboding that clung to me like a second skin. The corridors of Winnebago, once merely dim and oppressive, now seemed alive with a pulsating, malignant energy, a force that seeped from every cracked wall and rusted door hinge. In the days following my sessions with Clara, I began to experience strange phenomena that defied logical explanation. At night, the sound of soft scratching, once confined to my personal quarters, began to echo throughout the institute. It was as if the building itself were trying to communicate its ancient sorrows, each scrape a desperate plea from a long-forgotten soul. I would lie awake in my narrow dormitory, the glow of the fluorescent lamp casting erratic shadows across the peeling wallpaper, and listen as the gentle, rhythmic noise reverberated in the silence. It was both a lullaby and a dirge, a sound that promised to unmoor the mind and unsettle the heart. Even as I tried to document these occurrences in my battered notebook, I found that my own hands sometimes produced lines and phrases that I could not recall writing, cryptic messages like "the echo is near" or "you have opened the door." Each discovery deepened my dread, as if my efforts to understand the darkness were only acts. During the day, the oppressive aura of Winnebago manifested itself in subtle ways. I noticed how the peeling paint seemed to bear faint inscriptions if one looked closely enough, as though the building itself was inscribed with. My sessions with Clara grew increasingly intense. Each encounter in room 42 brought me face to face with an uncanny stillness that belied the tempest of emotions simmering beneath the surface. Clara's eyes, those deep, dark pools that had first captivated me, seemed to glow with an inner light during these sessions, as if they were windows into a realm of unimaginable sorrow. One day, as I sat across from her with my notebook open and my pen poised to capture her every gesture, Clara slowly lifted her hand and traced a delicate pattern in the air. The movement was so subtle that for a moment I doubted whether I had truly seen it. Yet, the air around her seemed to shimmer with a quiet energy, and I felt an inexplicable chill run through my body. "You listen too closely," she whispered, her voice soft and measured, yet laden with a finality that struck me to the core. I tried to ask what she meant, but my words caught in my throat as I realized that every question I had was suddenly insignificant compared to the overwhelming presence that now filled the room. The silence that followed was more oppressive than any clamor of words. I left room 42 that day feeling as if I were carrying a weight too heavy to bear, a weight composed not of physical maw. In the subsequent days, I noticed that the boundary between Winnebago and my own reality was beginning to blur. Even when I returned to the outside world, I carried with me the residue of that place, a persistent chill in the air, an ever-present sense of being watched, and a constant, subtle whisper that seemed to speak of things long past and sorrowful fates yet to come. I found myself plagued by nightmares, vivid, unrelenting dreams in which I wandered endless, labyrinthine corridors where the walls pulsed with an eerie, otherworldly rhythm and every door led to another chamber of despair. In these dreams, Clara appeared as a spectral figure, her eyes more intense and sorrowful than ever, beckoning me deeper into the darkness. I could hear the soft scratching of nails on wood, echoing in the distance, a sound that promised only further isolation and dread. When I awoke, drenched in sweat and trembling, I would often find my notebook open on my desk, as if the dreams had left their mark on the waking world, a single line inscribed in my familiar hand: "The echo follows you." At first, I dismissed these signs as the manifestations of a troubled mind. I told myself that the stress of my work, combined with the oppressive environment of Winnebago, was enough to cause hallucinations and fragments of memory to bleed into reality. But as the weeks turned into months, the experiences grew too consistent, too interconnected to be mere figments of an overactive imagination. I began to suspect that Winnebago harbored a force far beyond the boundaries of conventional explanation, an ancient sorrow, an echo of suffering that resonated through time, feeding on the despair of those who dwelled within its confines. I tried to speak with my colleagues about it, but my words were met with sympathetic nods and gentle reassurances that I was simply fatigued, that I was allowing my emotions to warp my perceptions. Deep down, however, I knew that something far more sinister was at play. My own sense of self began to fracture under the relentless pressure of these experiences. I no longer felt like a detached observer, but rather like an unwilling participant in a grand, macabre narrative, a narrative that was steadily unraveling the boundaries of my sanity. The line between what was real and what was imagined grew increasingly blurred. I would catch fleeting glimpses of a dark silhouette in a shop window or in the reflection of a rain-soaked street, only to see it vanish when I turned to face it directly. I questioned whether I had become a vessel for the ancient sorrow of Winnebago, whether the force that had haunted those crumbling halls had now found a home in my own heart. It was during one of these moments of introspection, as I sat alone in a dimly lit cafe late one rainy evening, that I realized with a jolt that I could no longer escape the echo. The clamor of everyday life, the chatter of patrons, the clinking of coffee cups, the soft jazz playing in the background could not drown out the persistent, insistent whisper that reverberated in my mind. I felt that the darkness was always with me, lurking just beneath the surface of ordinary moments, waiting for the right time to assert its presence. That realization filled me with both dread and a strange, perverse fascination. I began to collect every scrap of evidence, every anomalous detail, as if by cataloging the horror I might somehow gain control over it. I scoured the Institute's records, pored over old photographs of its long-deceased inhabitants, and even ventured into the abandoned wings of Winnebago when permitted, searching for any sign of the echo's origin. In these forays, I discovered that the building itself was steeped in a history of tragedy and despair, a legacy of lost souls whose stories had been swallowed by time. Faded inscriptions on crumbling walls, records of patients who had vanished without a trace, and whispered rumors among the remaining staff hinted at a malevolent force that had existed long before Winnebago became a mental institution. It was as if the very foundations of the building were built upon sorrow, and that sorrow had now grown into something sentient, a presence that fed on the anguish of the living and the dead alike. One cold, unyielding night, as a bitter wind howled through the broken windows of the Institute, I found myself once again standing in the corridor outside room 42. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door, torn between the need to understand and the instinct to flee. The silence was absolute, save for the distant hum of machinery and the soft, insistent scratching that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from a weak bulb that cast shifting, ghostly patterns across the floor. Clara was there, seated exactly as I had seen her countless times before, yet tonight her presence seemed even more commanding, as if she were the keeper of secrets too terrible to be spoken aloud. She looked at me with an intensity that made my heart pound in my chest, her eyes reflecting a sorrow so deep that it threatened to engulf me entirely. Without a word, she extended her hand, and for a long, agonizing moment, we simply sat in silence, two souls bound by a shared, inexplicable fate. In that stillness, I sensed that something had irrevocably changed between us. I felt the weight of her gaze as a tangible force, and for a brief, shuddering moment, I believed I could see the depths of her torment laid bare before me. It was then that I heard her whisper a sound so soft that it barely rose above the hum of the old bulb, "You are mine now." Those words, uttered with a finality that chilled me to the core, marked the moment when I realized that I had passed an irrevocable threshold. I was no longer merely an observer, I had become inextricably linked to the darkness of Winnebago, bound to it by forces that defied explanation. As I left room 42 that night, the echo of her words reverberated through the corridors of my mind, a haunting refrain that would follow me into every waking moment. Every step I took seemed measured by an unseen hand, every shadow whispered of forgotten sorrows, and every creak of the floorboards reminded me that the darkness was never far behind. I emerged into the night with a heart heavy with dread and a mind burdened by the knowledge that my fate was now entwined with that ancient, malevolent force. There was no turning back from the abyss into which I had willingly or perhaps unwittingly stepped. The echo, as I had come to understand it, was not a mere byproduct of a crumbling institution but a living, breathing presence that had claimed me as its own. And as I trudged through the cold, deserted streets of the city, I knew that no matter how far I ran, no distance could ever sever the tie that bound me to the sorrow of Winnebago. That night, in the solitude of my small apartment, I sat by a window watching the rain wash over the darkened pavement, feeling an emptiness inside that no amount of light or noise could fill. I opened my notebook and, with a trembling hand, wrote down the final words of that night, "I am not free." In the days that followed, my existence became a delicate balancing act between the world of the living and the haunting legacy of the asylum. I found myself oscillating between moments of ordinary life and sudden, inexplicable lapses into terror. I could be in the middle of a bustling street, surrounded by the lively chatter of passers-by, and then, without warning, a chill would descend upon me, a chill that brought with it the faint sound of scratching and the distant echo of Clara's voice. I began to understand that the darkness was not simply a remnant of a haunted building, it was a part of me now, an indelible mark on my soul that would never fade. The realization filled me with a profound sorrow, for I knew that the journey I had undertaken was one without an end, a path that would forever be shadowed by the lingering presence of an ancient despair. And so, as I stand at the threshold of my own uncertain future, I carry with me the memories of those tortured halls, the silent warnings of a woman who could not speak, and the ever-present sound of scrat. I left Winnebago long ago, or so I thought. The physical distance between me and the crumbling walls of that accursed institution did nothing to ease the burden that now weighed upon my soul. In the days, months, and years that followed my departure, I came to understand that the darkness I encountered there was not confined to its dilapidated corridors, it had followed me, insidiously embedding itself within every fiber of my being. Even in the bustling life of the city, amid the cacophony of human chatter and the vibrant chaos of neon lights, there lingered an ever-present whisper, a quiet, persistent murmur that reminded me that I was never truly free of Winnebago's legacy. Each morning I awoke to a world that should have been bright and full of promise, yet my reflection in the mirror revealed eyes that betrayed a deep and unyielding sorrow, as if the weight of those haunted halls had been etched permanently into my soul. It was in that state of perpetual disquiet that I began to search desperately for meaning in the strange phenomena that had marked my existence. I sought refuge in the routines of everyday life, attending work, meeting friends, even indulging in fleeting moments of distraction at crowded cafes. But no matter how hard I tried to immerse myself in the vibrancy of the living world, the echoes of Winnebago remained, a chill that ran along the back of my neck when I least expected it, a sudden flash of movement in the corner of my eye that vanished when I turned to look, and, most insidiously, the persistent sound of soft scratching that seemed to follow me wherever I went. It was during one particularly cold winter evening, as I sat alone in my modest apartment with rain tapping against the window pane, that I first encountered the unmistakable sign that the darkness had grown bolder. The room was quiet, lit only by a single lamp whose light danced weakly across worn furniture and faded photographs of happier times, images that now seemed painfully distant. As I sat there, lost in thought, I heard a slow, deliberate tapping at my front door. My heart pounded as I rose to answer it, each step measured and hesitant. When I opened the door, I was greeted not by a visitor, but by an empty, rain-soaked corridor stretching out into darkness. Yet the sound persisted, coming not from the threshold but from within me, a soft, rhythmic scratching that vibrated with an almost sentient intensity. I closed the door quickly, my hands trembling as I leaned against it, feeling as though I were caught between two worlds, the safe, mundane reality of my apartment and the shadowed, relentless horror that had once dwelled within Winnebago. That night, I lay awake for hours, unable to force sleep as the scratching grew louder in my ears and the whisper of distant voices mingled with the howl of the wind outside. In those long, tortured hours, I began to understand with a painful clarity that the darkness was no longer merely an echo of the past, it had become a part of me. I recalled Clara's soft, almost imperceptible words from room 42, "You are part of this now." At first, I had dismissed them as the ramblings of a damaged mind. But now, as the terror seeped into every moment of solitude, I realized that I had, in some inexplicable way, been claimed by that ancient sorrow. The realization was both a curse and a revelation, for it explained the unshakable chill that haunted me, the way my dreams were invaded by visions of endless, labyrinthine corridors and spectral figures with sorrowful eyes. In these dreams, I would wander aimlessly through halls lined with faded inscriptions and ghostly murals that told stories of despair, each step echoing with the silent cries of those who had once suffered within Winnebago. Clara's image would appear at the end of these endless corridors, her eyes filled with a profound sadness that resonated with the very core of my being, and I would feel an overwhelming urge to reach out to her, a futile attempt to grasp some remnant of the humanity I feared was slipping away. As the years passed, I sought every means to exorcise the darkness that had latched onto me. I attended therapy sessions, met with spiritual counselors, and even experimented with ancient rituals found in obscure texts. Yet nothing could erase the lingering presence of the echo, as I came to call it a name that encapsulated the ceaseless murmurs of sorrow and despair that followed me like a shadow. The more I struggled to rid myself of it, the more insidious it became, like a parasite that grew stronger the more it fed on my fear. There were moments, in the quiet of dawn, when I would stand by a window and watch the sun rise, trying to find solace in the gentle light that slowly chased away the night. But even then, in the soft glow of morning, I could feel the darkness lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, a reminder that the past was never truly behind me, that the pain of Winnebago had woven itself into the very fabric of my existence. I began to document my experiences with a fervor born of desperation. Every whispered message, every fleeting glimpse of a shadow in a shop window, every inexplicable scratch on a door or piece of furniture was recorded in meticulous detail in a journal that became both my confessional and my chronicle of despair. In those pages, I wrote not only of the terror that had overtaken my nights but also of the subtle shifts in my perception, how I started to see the world through a lens of grief, how the ordinary became infused with the weight of unspoken histories and unseen tragedies. I wrote of the way the laughter of children in the park would sometimes die away abruptly, replaced by a sudden, inexplicable silence that felt as though it carried the echoes of 1,000 lost souls. I recorded the moments when, walking along a busy street, I would feel an almost tangible presence at my back, a cold, unyielding force that seemed to whisper, "You cannot escape." In those moments, I knew with an aching certainty that Winnebago was not just a chapter of my past, but an enduring part of my future, a future where the line between the living and the dead was irrevocably blurred. The darkness had claimed me, and in its embrace, I found a sorrow that was both overwhelming and strangely familiar. As I write these words, I realize that I have come to accept the inevitability of my fate. The legacy of Winnebago, with all its ancient grief and spectral whispers, has become intertwined with my identity. I no longer live in denial or in a futile hope of escape. Instead, I acknowledge the shadow that walks beside me, a constant reminder that some truths are too profound to be dismissed as mere hallucinations. Clara Henshaw, with her silent, enigmatic presence, remains forever etched in my memory, a symbol of the inescapable sorrow that has defined my journey. And as I continue to navigate a world that is both luminous and haunted, I have learned that there is a certain beauty in embracing the darkness within, for it is through our scars and our deepest fears that we come to understand the resilience of the human spirit. Yet even as I speak these words, a part of me mourns the loss of innocence, the simple hope of a life unburdened by the echoes of despair. I know that the darkness will always be with me, that the soft, unyielding scratch of the unseen will forever remind me of the price I paid for listening too closely to the sorrow of Winnebago. But in that painful acceptance, I have found a strange liberation, a recognition that while I may never be free of the past, I can choose to honor it, to let it guide me as I forge a path through the perpetual twilight of memory and longing. Now, as I close this final chapter of my chronicle, I am left with a quiet resolve, to carry the legacy of Winnebago not as a curse, but as a reminder of the depths of human suffering and the indomitable strength required to endure it. I stand at the threshold of each new day with eyes that have seen too much, yet with a heart that still beats with a fierce determination to find meaning in the midst of darkness. For in every shattered moment, in every echo of despair, there lies the faintest promise of redemption, a promise that even the deepest scars can someday become the map by which we navigate our own journey toward the light. And so, I continue to live, to write, and to bear witness to the haunting beauty of our shared sorrow, knowing that the darkness, however relentless, is but one part of the complex tapestry that makes us human. As we draw the curtain on this journey into the dark depths of Winnebago, we are left with reflections on the divergent paths that fate can offer. In the story of Clara Henshaw, a woman whose silent suffering and tragic fate embodied the relentless pull of despair, we see a stark contrast to those who managed, against all odds, to break free from the chains of their past. While Clara's life is a haunting testament to how unaddressed trauma can fester and consume a soul, the stories of others who managed to reclaim their lives offer a powerful message of hope and resilience. Imagine the lives of those who, unlike Clara, encountered hardships yet found a way to embrace healing. These individuals, despite facing personal demons and the scars of past tragedies, were able to forge a path toward redemption. They sought help in the form of supportive relationships, therapy, and sometimes, just the simple act of sharing their burdens with someone who cared. Their journeys remind us that recovery is not a linear process, it is an often winding road that demands courage, persistence, and above all, the willingness to seek light in even the darkest moments. In many ways, their stories serve as a beacon for those still trapped in the labyrinth of isolation, proof that even when the weight of sorrow seems insurmountable, there exists the possibility of renewal. Clara's narrative, on the other hand, is a somber illustration of what happens when a person is left to battle the relentless shadows alone. Her life, marred by neglect, isolation, and the heavy burden of unresolved pain, serves as a cautionary tale. She became entangled in a web of her own making, where every unspoken word and every suppressed emotion fanned the flames of an inner darkness. In Clara's world, the absence of support and the failure to address deep-rooted trauma led to a destiny where the scars of the past not only defined her but consumed her. Her eyes, once filled with the possibility of redemption, gradually turned into windows to an abyss, a place where hope was drowned by despair. Yet, even in the midst of such overwhelming tragedy, there is a lesson that resonates for each of us. The stark contrast between those who managed to escape the clutches of their darkest moments and those who, like Clara, were overwhelmed by them is not merely a matter of luck, it is a reflection of the choices made along the way. For many, the decision to reach out, to seek professional help, or even to confide in a trusted friend can be the turning point that prevents a slide into irreparable darkness. Their stories affirm that healing is a process, one that often begins with the simple act of acknowledging that one's pain is real and deserving of attention. In our modern society, where resources for mental health have increased and communities are more aware of the importance of emotional support, we still face the tragic reality that many individuals continue to suffer in silence. The legacy of Winnebago is not confined to its crumbling walls, it lives on in every neglected cry for help and every life that slips away without intervention. It is a stark reminder that while some are fortunate enough to find the support they need and emerge with scars that eventually turn into marks of strength, others are left to endure a fate that is as heartbreaking as it is avoidable. For those who were lucky enough to find solace and begin the healing process, their journeys underscore the resilience of the human spirit. They show us that even in the aftermath of profound loss and trauma, there is potential for rebirth. Their scars, though they may serve as a constant reminder of past wounds, eventually become symbols of survival, a testament to the power of compassion, empathy, and human connection. These individuals remind us that every life, no matter how marred by tragedy, contains the seeds of hope. In the face of despair, their perseverance stands as a defiant challenge to the darkness that seeks to claim them. They are living proof that it is possible to transform pain into strength, to convert sorrow into the determination to create a better future. Clara's story, as tragic as it is, imparts a valuable lesson, that ignoring or failing to address the deep emotional wounds of our past can lead to a cycle of despair that is difficult to break. It calls on each of us to be vigilant about our own mental and emotional well-being and to reach out when the shadows begin to overwhelm. It challenges us to build communities where vulnerability is met with understanding and where no one has to suffer in isolation. The contrasts drawn between those who manage to heal and those who remain trapped in their personal nightmares compel us to consider what more can be done to ensure that every individual has access to the help they need. It is a call for empathy, a reminder that behind every silent struggle is a human being yearning for connection and support. As we conclude this exploration into the echoes of Winnebago, I invite you to reflect on these truths. Life, with all its beauty and heartbreak, is a tapestry woven from threads of both light and darkness. While some may be fortunate to see the dawn after a long, bitter night, others may find themselves lost in an endless twilight. Yet even in the darkest moments, there is the possibility of renewal, the chance to rewrite one's story and emerge with a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. I want to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to all of you who have joined us on this journey into the depths of despair and the enduring power of hope. Your willingness to confront these challenging narratives is a testament to your strength and compassion. By engaging with these stories, you are not only bearing witness to the harsh realities of a troubled past but also contributing to a broader conversation about healing, resilience, and the transformative power of empathy. Thank you for watching Inside the Criminal World, for listening to the echoes of those who have suffered, and for embracing the difficult truths that lie beneath the surface of our shared human experience. As you go forward, may the lessons of this story inspire you to reach out to those in need, to offer kindness even when it seems the world is shrouded in darkness, and to remember that every person has the potential to find light amidst the shadows. In the end, it is our ability to overcome adversity, to turn our scars into symbols of survival, that defines us as human. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and may you always find hope, even in the bleakest of times. Thank for watching.